Down in New Orleans where the blues was born, it takes a cool cat to blow a horn. On LaSalle and Rampart Street, the combos play with the mambo beat. The Mardi Gras mambo, 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 Mardi Gras mambo, 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 Mardi Gras mambo. Down in New Orleans, in Great Town where the cats saw me, it's the Mardi Gras mambo with the beat. Shout it cheer for the Zulu King, and truck on down with the mambo swing. The Mardi Gras mambo, 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 Mardi Gras mambo, 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 Mardi Gras mambo. Down in New Orleans. Down in New Orleans where the blues were born, it takes a cool cat to blow a horn. On LaSalle and Rampart Street, the combos play with the mambo beat. The Mardi Gras mambo, 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 Mardi Gras mambo, 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 Mardi Gras mambo. Down in New Orleans, Mardi Gras mambo, 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 Mardi Gras mambo, 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 Mardi Gras mambo, mambo, mambo,
The Hawkettes here at 98.1 KZE with Mardi Gras Mambo. I'm here with Ken McCarthy, and he selected that tune in particular because we're going to be talking about the relationship of New Orleans and Havana, I think in particular, but Cuba. And I'll introduce him in a second. I just want to say he has an amazing relationship with New Orleans. I think I could ask him about just about anything, Jazz Fest or jazz. And he has an amazing relationship with jazz. I think he is the perfect person to have here on International Jazz Day. I'm thinking many of you are aware of something called Jazz on the Tube. I know I'm a subscriber, and on a regular basis, I think at least once a day, and sometimes more than once, you get these amazing videos that bring to life some classics, really important music. And Ken is one of the forces behind that. So now I'll let Ken get a word in here. Hi, welcome to Saturday Gumbo.
Hey, Susan, thanks for having me. This is fun to be on KZE, my favorite Hudson Valley station.
Oh, hey,
It's true. It's true. I'm so glad you guys exist.
Actually, I guess you said that you have even worked with KZE a little bit.
Yeah, the second year after the floods in New Orleans, I was invited to do a 3-hour show, and I jumped at it, and we basically did a survey of, quote, modern from post-war to present New Orleans music, and to try to, because at that time, people weren't sure New Orleans was going to come back, and part of what I was very involved with then was to tell people, it's going to come back, go and listen, and help restart it. And that was part of what the show was about.
And, it's amazing what has happened down there. And you may have to come back for another show so we can cover everything. Can you tell us a little, well, first I'm curious, how did you get so hooked on jazz? Do you have any early memories that explain that?
Somehow I got the idea to buy Kinda Blue when I was in high school. And then I lucked out and bought a Billie Holiday record with Lester Young on it. And I just thought it was the most amazing music I had ever heard. And then when I got to college, I happened to be roommates with Stanley Jordan, who's a pretty good jazz guitar player. And, we just fed off each other in our love of the music. And then there was a guy, haven't seen him in a long time, Neil Carton, who was a good friend. And this guy, you could drop a needle on any jazz record, and he'd tell you the day it was recorded, who was in the session, who had a cold. And he was my tutor when I was doing radio shows every day.
I think jazz people more than average care about who had a cold and who was there. That's pretty amazing. And you did a radio show, you say, too. Was that jazz?
Yeah, it was jazz. It was 2 hours a day, 5 days a week, and then some late-night stuff, too, for years down at Princeton. It was a lot of fun.
Welcome back to radio, then. So you went to Cuba. That was a big deal. How did that come about?
That was just amazing. Well, I'm a fan and friend of Ned Sublette, the great musician and producer and musicologist, and the author of Cuba and Its Music. And he's been talking about wanting to go back to Cuba, but it was really, really, really hard. And with this new liberalization, he felt confident to start bringing groups again. So I jumped and joined the group, and we were there for 10 days, and we saw 23 performances in 10 days. Many of them just staged for us. It was a group of musicians and producers and academics, and we were in Havana for a while. We were in Matanzas for a while, which is a very important city, and we were out on the west of the island too, in Tobacco Land, and hearing amazing. It was amazing.
So you're back, and we're going to be talking especially about Havana and Cuba's influence on New Orleans music. So what did you hear in the Hawkettes? Now, that's a very old recording, fairly old at least. And young Art Neville, 15 years old at the time, was on there.
Yeah.
And maybe a little closer.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So why did you pick that one to kick it off?
Well, to show that the cats in New Orleans were listening to Cuban music in that period. I mean, the fact that they put the name Mambo in there, and they did have kind of a Latin roll to that thing. Mambo was red hot in the 40s and 50s in America. I mean, it was hotter than hot. In fact, the first kind of free-form dancing, with every, flailing around was not rock and roll. It was Mambo at the great Palladium dance hall in New York City, and you can see footage of it. And they were pre-Elvis Presley, and they were doing all the things that Elvis Presley was doing 5-10 years later. So because of the embargo and all the crazy stuff that's gone on in the last 50-plus years, we've forgotten that Cuban music was flooded the United States starting in the 1930 really, and it was super popular. So all the guys in New Orleans were listening to it. Now, they didn't become Cuban musicians, but they listened to the rhythms, they listened to the driving of it, the beat, the horn arrangements, and they borrowed stuff.
Isn't that one of the great things about that city, just how much it borrows and how many influences it brought in? But, I don't remember it. You're reminding me of the idea that there were great Cuban orchestras in New York, in the United States, that people listened to that had hits. And I guess that stopped right around the embargo, or? Yeah,
it was like a guillotine. I mean, everything was going along, and all of a sudden, boom! I mean, it got. Don't forget. Not only could we not travel there, and musicians couldn't travel there. Their musicians couldn't come here, but also their products couldn't come here. And it got crazy because it's very political. Like, for instance, there were cases where we're in a radio station now, where in Miami, right-wing Cubans would go to radio stations that were playing contemporary Cuban music and threaten to tear the place up. Don't support Castro. Don't play the Cuban music.
So very little got in.
Trickle. It went from like we were swimming in it to suddenly just the smallest little trickle, a little drop here, a little drop there. So we have this kind of cultural amnesia.
So I'm really curious on your trip whether the Cuban music you heard what that gap was, the kind of changes that might have been going on in Cuba that we wouldn't know here. But I'm wondering if we should do the Dave Bartholomew tune you picked and talk more about the New Orleans relationship first.
Yeah, this is really important. Anybody that's been in New Orleans, for instance, you walk around in the French Quarter and you'll see these plaques that say this street used to be called Hernandez Street. There was a big chunk of time where New Orleans was administered by the Spanish, and it was administered out of Cuba, right? So, and then you have Jelly Roll Morton, for example, talking about the Spanish tinge. We talk about the same way we sometimes say somebody's Spanish when they're from Colombia or they're from Peru. They were doing the same thing, or we call Spanish Harlem.
Right.
Well, that was Puerto Ricans and Dominicans and Cubans. There were no Spanish people from Spain in Spanish Harlem.
Right.
They did the same thing in New Orleans. They would just say Spanish as a catchword, and they were talking about, believe it or not, there were a lot of Mexican musicians in New Orleans. There's another story, influenced by New Orleans. But there were a lot of Cubans in New Orleans playing music. So when he says Spanish tinge is essential to jazz, he really should have said the Cuban influence is essential to jazz.
Well, I wish he had, because Spanish tinge certainly stuck, and it is misleading once you explain it that way.
But here's a thing hidden in plain sight. He also talked about the habanera rhythm. Well, a habanera is a female from Havana, like a New Yorker. It's like a New Yorkette.
Huh.
So it's like that's just like right in our face, and we don't even see it.
Wow.
Now, the rhythm may originally be African, but like so many things, it got processed in Cuba and then broadcast to the rest of the Western Hemisphere. That was Cuba's role. This is a really important thing to understand. Cuba's not just another country that has some music. Cuba is, to me, almost the equivalent of the United States. We develop rock and roll and blues. They develop salsa and son and bolero and cha-cha-cha and mambo and all this stuff. And one other last little piece. When people say Latin music, if it's popular, 90% of the time they really should be saying Cuban-originated music. It's just Latin becomes the stamp that's been put on it.
Well, so I'm thinking this trip for you must have been, you've never been to Cuba before?
No, I mean, in my whole life, I probably could have snuck in or something, but I wanted to do it legally. We did it the Treasury Department's, approved way. But no, it's my first time, so, oh my God, it was unbelievable.
So let's set up this Dave Bartholomew
Yes.
tune, and it's going to be followed by Presley.
Right.
Yes.
Right. Okay, Dave Bartholomew, I'm sure a lot of your listeners know, one of the pioneers, the root pioneers of rock and roll, and he was certainly the pioneer of rhythm and blues, produced so many people, including Fats Domino, had his own bands. And this is a tune called Country Boy. Now, everybody's going to recognize this riff and go, what's so big about this? Well, what's so big about it is this is the first time this riff ever appeared on an American record. And Dave Bartholomew was very forthcoming when asked. He said, I borrowed it from a Cuban record. So this riff that's at the absolute core of American rock and roll came off a Cuban record. We're going to hear a slow version, the original Country Boy. Then we're going to hear another Country Boy rock and roll with it. It's the same beat. It's just a little bit faster. So the second one will be a surprise, but everyone will recognize it right away.
Okay, here we go.
I'm a little country boy, running wild in this big old town. I'm a little country boy, running wild in this big old town. Yes, all the girls love me, 'cause they know what I'm putting down. Yes, they call me country, 'cause I'm from a country town. But when I'm with my baby, I don't want a soul around. Yes, I'm from the country, running wild in this big old town. Yes, all the girls love me, 'cause they know what I'm putting down. It was early Saturday morning, I was feeling low and tired. She said, get up good for nothing, give me my morning exercise. Yes, I'm from the country, running wild in this big old town. Yes, all the girls love me, 'cause they know what I'm putting down.
they call me country, 'cause I'm from a country town. But when I'm with my baby, I don't want to soul around. Yes, I'm from the country, running wild in this big old town. All the gals love me, 'cause they know what I'm putting down.
You ain't nothing but a hound dog, you're crying all the time. You ain't nothing but a hound dog, crying all the time. Well, you ain't never caught a rabbit and you ain't no friend of mine. Well, they said you was high class. Well, that was just a lie. Yeah, they said you was high class. Well, that was just a lie. Yeah, you ain't never caught a rabbit and you ain't no friend of mine. You ain't nothing but a hound dog, crying all the time. You ain't nothing but a hound dog, crying all the time. Well, you ain't never caught a rabbit and you ain't no friend of mine. Well, they said you was high class. Well, that was just a lie. Yeah, they said you was high class. Well, that was just a lie. Yeah, you ain't never caught a rabbit and you ain't no friend of mine. Well, they said you was high class. Well, that was just a lie. You know they said you was high class. Well, that was just a lie. Well, you ain't never caught a rabbit and you ain't no friend of mine. You ain't nothing but a hound dog, crying all the time. You ain't nothing but a hound dog, crying all the time. Well, you ain't never caught a rabbit. You ain't no friend of mine.
You are tuned to Saturday Gumbo here at 98.1 KZE. And yes, that was Elvis Presley and Hound Dog. And who knew it had Cuban roots? I didn't. I didn't till today. I'm here with Ken McCarthy, who is back from a trip to Havana. We're talking about Havana and Cuban music's influence in the United States, particularly on New Orleans, of course, because this is Saturday Gumbo after all. So you want to say that was a surprise.
Yeah.
I never thought of Hound Dog that way.
Yeah. Well, the beat was laid down by Dave Bartholomew, and he always said, I got it off a Cuban record. He said he got it off a rumba record, but he probably didn't. He probably got it off a son record, S-O-N, which is a different style.
Yeah.
But the thing that I think is important for people to grasp is when Dave Bartholomew was coming up, when Elvis Presley was coming up, the U.S. was just afloat in a sea of Cuban music. The hottest club in the U.S. was probably the Palladium Ballroom, which was in the sort of the Times Square area, and they were dancing mambo music. There was no rock and roll then. This is like 50, 51, 52. So the cats in New Orleans would have been well aware of what was happening in New York, but they also would have been hearing Cuban radio, because it's not that far away.
Yeah.
And in those days, there weren't so many stations, so the signal would have traveled. So musicians, they play their own thing, but they like to hear other things, especially good musicians. So you can easily envision, and Dave Bartholomew said, you can easily envision these guys just sitting around and digging the Cuban music. Now, they're not going to become Cuban musicians because they have their own tradition, but they're going to hear bass lines, they're going to hear riffs, they're going to hear rhythms, beats, and they're going to integrate them. And we're going to play a thing in a second, which is something that Dave Bartholomew may have been listening to. And on this record, this is a very famous Cuban musician in Cuba. We should all know of him. It's Arsenio Rodriguez. There's a form of music called son, S-O-N, And if you've ever seen Buena Vista Social Club, some of the tunes, not all of them, but some of the tunes they performed are sones. It's guitar, bongos, that kind of thing, which, believe it or not, when it first emerged, was considered degenerate, ghetto, low-life music by the elites of that beautiful, sweet music.
Yeah.
Why was it considered that? Because they had hand-played drums. Believe it or not, that was considered just an anathema among the elites who ran Cuba.
Really sort of an undignified way of conducting yourself.
Because they had just won their independence from Spain, and they wanted to present. We're talking about the elite people now, not normal people, and they wanted to present this polished. We're just as European as you are, and then all of a sudden there's this huge population of Afro-Cubans playing African-derived music. And they brought a little bit of it into the sun with the bongos, which are a Cuban invention, by the way. If you ever see anyone playing bongos, that instrument was designed and invented by Cubans. And so that was considered like a rough kind of music. But gradually it got accepted. By the way, something that people should know, in the 30s in Paris, everyone knows jazz was popular and it was the cool thing to go hear jazz. Cuban music was on par with jazz in the cafes of Paris. So anyway, Arsenio Rodriguez was important because he took this basic music, the son, and added things to it: piano, more horns, just more energy, more vitality. Not that it didn't have vitality, but just more juice to it. So people like Dave Bartholomew would have been listening to Arsenio Rodriguez.
So I just have to throw an odd one out.
Sure.
I grew up on Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz.
Yeah.
So he's Cuban.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think introduced a lot of people to the concept and maybe a stereotypical, almost caricature of a Cuban band and band leader.
Right. Well, again, envision this. In the old days, before TV, before the internet, it was radio and there were records. But one of the big ways that music was presented was in hotel ballrooms in New York City. So, they would have, everyone would dress up and go out, and there'd always be two orchestras because the musicians have to rest their chops. So there was literally Benny Goodman, and then they'd take a break, and then Xavier Cugat would come out. And Xavier Cugat was a Spaniard, but he played Cuban music, and he really played up the Cuban thing very strongly. And that was a very common balance. You'd have a swing band, a big band that we think of, and then you'd have a Cuban band with a little bit, with a big percussion session and dancing and that kind of thing. So Ricky Ricardo, I call him Ricky Ricardo, but Desi Arnaz, wasn't really a musician. He was an entertainer and a performer, and he was actually. He actually got his chops as an entertainer in Miami because his family had to flee Cuba. They had to flee Cuba for a different reason, which is too long to go into. But by the way, Cuba is very volatile politically. It has been since day one. So what's going on now is just another chapter in a long saga. It's a difficult place to live, But his family had to leave, and he had a nightclub back in Miami for the Cuban expats. And he was basically spoofing a very famous musician, Miguelito Valdez, right down to the hair, to the gyrating with the drums, the Babalu, singing Babalu. I mean, one of the things I'm going to do a presentation next week, and I'm going to show the two films right next to each other, and you're going to be like, I can't believe that this is an exact copy of this famous musician.
Wow. That's going to be really interesting. Yeah. We have to get that. We'll talk about the Tivoli Library presentation when we come back with Ken McCarthy. Right now we're going to be listening to, can you say his name again for me?
Yeah, this is Arsenio Rodriguez, and what I think that people like Dave Bartholomew would have dug is, number one, the horn work is amazing, right? The rhythms are amazing. And Arsenio was one of the first people to electrify his tres, which is kind of a form of Cuban guitar. Let's simplify it that way. So this is the kind of music that Dave Bartholomew would have been listening to.
All right, we're all ready for that, and you are tuned to 98.1 KZE.
Baila, baila, Simón. 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 Como baila.
98.1 KZE, and I am here. I'm Susan Shaw. This is Saturday Gumbo. I'm here with Ken McCarthy. We're talking about Havana and its influences musically on New Orleans, and actually sounds like pretty much the world, really. But more with Ken when we come back. We've got more music, and you're going to have a chance to meet up with Ken. We'll talk about that, as I said, in just a minute here at 98.1 KZE.
Hi, Carl from Village Wine and Spirits in Millbrook with some tips about finding value in wine. Value just doesn't mean inexpensive. You want the most enjoyment for every dollar spent. And value in wine is coming from Chile and Argentina these days, along with some new wines from the old world. Campagna in Italy, Rioja in Spain, and a rebound in values from Bordeaux. We have tons of twofers, crisp and citrusy Chilean Sauvignon Blanc, 2 bottles for $10, interesting Italian Pinot Noir, 2 for $14, and 2 bottles of Bordeaux for $20, just to name a few. Buy in quantity and receive 10 to 20% off your case purchases. Gather 12 of your favorites, even the specially priced twofers, and save even more. For more of these tips, visit us in person at 45 Front Street in Millbrook, New York, or on the web at villagewinemillbrook.com. We carry a wide array of wines that are varietally correct, balanced, and ultimately expressive of their place in the world. An extensive selection of artisan spirits from around the globe and very close to home, with wine tastings every Saturday. Find what your palate's been searching for. We're open every day.
The Falcon. Experience live world-class music, an inspiring art gallery, and extraordinary dining every show night and at Sunday brunch overlooking the magnificent Marlborough Falls at 1348 Route 9W in Marlborough, New York. Away from Manhattan's urban frenzy, one man's hospitality has created an intimate stage for top-tier musicians, says the New York Times.
Thursday, Chris Poland CD release. Friday, Island Head Reggae. Saturday, Bernard Purdy and Friends. There's a Sunday brunch with Big Joe Fitz and the Lo-Fis. Sunday evening, Frankie Joe Daigle. And Monday, Joe Louis Walker and Friends with Morale Coryell.
No tickets, no cover. Open at 5:30, music at 7. Sunday brunch 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. Call for dinner reservations. The Falcon, where your donations support living artists. Live at thefalcon.com. Spell it out, check it out.
We're gonna ride all night. Gonna ride all night.
I'm Daniel Esco from Berkshire Co-op Market in Great Barrington. You're listening to 98.1 KZE.
And you're tuned to Saturday Gumbo. As I said, I'm here with Ken McCarthy. We are talking about Cuban music, and did we have more to say about, let's just announce, can you tell me again so people know who that was, the last one we played before the break?
That was Arsenio Rodriguez.
No.
And that was Arsenio Rodriguez, and that's the kind of, I'm sure Dave Bartholomew listened to Arsenio Rodriguez. I mean, I would actually bet my life on it, because he was a very important guy, and his stuff was all over the place, all over the airwaves, all over the records, and
it was quite a wild sound, really. That guitar that you call a what?
A trace.
A trace.
Like uno, dos, tres.
Ah.
It's like a guitar-like instrument that encompasses 3 different other instruments. I forget which they are, but one of them is a guitar.
Uh-huh. So you were saying that the influence we're talking about is Dave Bartholomew. We're talking about early. Well, I think Country Boy came out in 1950, but it goes back, this Cuban influence, the Spanish tinge.
Right.
So
right.
Who else would you like to talk about?
Well, one thing that people often talk about, one of the reasons jazz exploded in New Orleans was just a logistical thing, was that suddenly there were a lot of cheap brass instruments available in pawn shops. And I've heard people say, well, that's from the Civil War. No, it's from the Spanish-American War, much later. And what people need to know, historically, if they're interested in this kind of thing, is that New Orleans was the staging ground for the Spanish-American War. So all these guys came from all over the country, and there were black soldiers involved in that war, came to New Orleans, hung out, got to know the music, got on a ship, went to Havana, fought, stayed sometimes for years, and there were military bands that were part of that operation, certainly absorbed some Cuban stuff, went back to New Orleans, some of them hawked their instruments in New Orleans, and that's why there was this super supply of brass instruments in New Orleans at the turn of the century.
Okay, so we're talking right around 1900.
1900, yeah.
And were they taking New Orleans music over to...
Of course. Musicians, musicians don't live in airtight boxes, so clearly they were bringing some stuff over to New Orleans. I mean, to Havana. For example, the son music that we were talking about is this form that's kind of goes back to nobody knows exactly because it emerged before recording, so it's very hard to tell really where it came from. The theory is it came from the east part of Cuba and made its way to the big city and then got progressively more and more sophisticated. Well, one of the changes they made in the 20s was they added trumpet. The traditional son didn't have a trumpet. It was guitar and bongos and some other shaking instruments, maybe maracas. And then they were listening. I'm sure they were listening to the American guys and thinking, that trumpet sounds great. Let's put it into our thing.
That's so cool.
Yeah, so it's a communication. It's not a one-way, New Orleans is just sitting there receiving inspiration. Certainly New Orleans was because don't forget, remember, the radio signals work both ways. Those great New Orleans stations, which, by the way, made it to northern Mississippi and Tupelo and Memphis and influenced so many rock and rollers, also went to Cuba, and people listened, and they didn't necessarily say, okay, I'm going to become a American rhythm and blues artist, but they were influenced.
It's the coolest interaction, and it seems to me you are practically on a mission between Jazz on the Tube, which, as I say, and I guess there's a jazzonthetube.com.
Yes, jazzonthetube.com.
Website where people can find out more about that. But I know it's amazing to open your emails and you know what's in there. But there's this beautiful thing that comes through. It is a jazz video with information, sometimes celebrating somebody's birthday, sometimes it must have just crossed your awareness and you put it up there. But it brings something beautiful to your day, and it fills out, for me, my sense of a song I may have heard a million times to see a video that you've chosen to share that. And now you're going to also, which I'm very aware you can do this, I can see it, you're going to be at the Tivoli Free Library to talk about exactly how would you describe what you'll be talking about?
What I'm going to try to do is in 1 hour show people the major landmarks of Cuban music. First, show them that they actually know they've been influenced by Cuban music even if they don't know it. So some of the things that we've talked about today I'm going to be playing, but there's a lot more along those lines. And then I'm going to be showing some of the great Cuban artists of the last century, just so people can get a feel. My mission is, Lord willing, and this nice trend that we're on continues, a lot of people are going to be going to Cuba, a lot of music fans, a lot of jazz fans, and of course that's my background. And I want to make sure when they go to Cuba, they're already informed and educated so that they know they fully appreciate what they're seeing. Imagine if people went to Rome and had never heard of the Roman Empire. And they're going, oh, these are beautiful pillars and the spaghetti's good, and they didn't even know that all this history happened. I mean, we're kind of in that place with Cuba. We really don't. The average American, I would include myself in that, is not educated about Cuba. Nobody teaches it us in school. It's just an island down there. They have cigars and rum and, I don't know, Castro, and I guess that's it. But no, it's a very, very important place culturally for us, for Americans.
So I'm wondering, for those of us, just like for those of us that listen to this show that aren't going to New Orleans, I think there's a lot of ways to experience New Orleans through the music, through stories, the whole thing. Is some of that going to start coming in here from Cuba? I mean, are we going to be able to start hearing contemporary Cuban music here in the United States?
It's the whole infrastructure has to be rebuilt from scratch. I mean, when people ask me about Havana and Cuba, I say it's like New Orleans on steroids in two ways. One, the music's off the hook. The number of musicians. I mean, New Orleans is amazing. So many. You turn around, there's another great musician. It's like that in Cuba even more. And just as just as New Orleans had a flood that wiped out its infrastructure, essentially what's happened to Cuba because of this stupid embargo. It's a materially just they need everything. The whole thing has to be rebuilt from. It's as if the whole thing got wiped out and has to be started over from scratch. Not the art, not the culture, not the intelligence, not the people, but just the infrastructure of getting music onto wax or digital now, and then getting it out into the airwaves. And for instance, Cubans can't start their own podcast because they don't have enough bandwidth. The U.S. has, limited the bandwidth that goes to Cuba dramatically. So they can't just say, hey, I'm going to do a podcast. or I am going to do a website. So that's one of the things we're going to do with Jazz on the Tube. We've already got a Cuba section on our website, and we're putting tremendous resources now into producing content, educational content now about Cuba and America and how they relate to each other. And we're going to be documenting the cats that are down there now. Everyone knows the famous musicians. They don't need help. They've got an infrastructure. They're already out of the country. They're traveling the world. But what about the young guys? You know, they have no way to get known. So we're going to be one of the places that people can go to jazzonthetube.com/Cuba.
Oh, very cool. And again, it's coming up on Friday, May 6th at the Tivoli Free Library. You can hear more about what we've been talking about, and music and visuals too.
Oh yeah, I got a lot of video that's going to blow people's minds, if I do say so myself.
Well, thank you so much for coming today, Ken. And I know we have one more tune for everybody.
Yeah.
Well, how about telling us about it?
Well, we've talked about the influence of Cuban musicians and music on the rhythm and blues and the roots of rock and roll, but it goes way back. We mentioned Jelly Roll Morton always talked about the Spanish tinge. Then our next tune is St. Louis Blues, and it was the first official blues recording and song ever made by W.C. Handy. And W.C. Handy, believe it or not, spent time in Cuba. And when you listen to this, and it's played by the great Louis Armstrong, when you listen to this, I don't know if I've heard this particular version of it, but typically the introduction is a total Latin thing, and then it switches into American swing time. You probably have heard this song a million times and never noticed that. But this W.C. Handy's St. Louis Blues, seminal piece of music, critical to the whole history of the blues in America, has I'm not going to say Spanish tinge, it has a Cuban tinge in the opening. So check it out.
Cool. I hope we got a good version for you. Thanks again, Ken. Check him out at the Tivoli Free Library, May 6th, and more information at jazzonthetube.com. You're tuned to Saturday Gumbo here at 98.1 KZE, and now we have W.C. Handy.
Louis Armstrong playing W.C. Handy's.
No, I think it's W.C.
Oh, it is. Well, that's cool. That's cool. We'll get it straight from. But you got to really listen because the intro goes pretty fast. Yep.
Celebrating musical diversity in the Berkshires, the Litchfield Hills, and the Mid-Hudson Valley, we are 98.1 and 105.9 in Red Hook, WKZE-FM, Salisbury, Red Hook.